Good day, learners, and welcome to television-based format learning experience or TBFLEx, a reliable source for flexible and engaging learning. My name is Mr. Laurence Tapas, but you can just call me Sir Mark. Every day is an opportunity to become better versions of ourselves. So what are you waiting for? Buckle up and join me as we explore, learn and enjoy the wonderful world of English Grade 8. Hello there! After you have deepened your understanding on the use of appropriate grammatical signals or expressions suitable to any patterns of idea development during our last episode, at the end of this one, you were expected to learn how to differentiate primary from secondary sources of information and sort out the various informative materials into primary and secondary sources of information. But before that, make sure that you have your pen, paper, and Grade 8 Self-Learning module with you. Mark my word that this is going to be fun. Let's go!
How will you know if a post you've read in your social media account is real or fake? How will you verify it? Study the claim allegedly made by President Rodrigo Duterte posted in social media. In this post, the president was quoted to have said that he will punch Senator Manny Pacquiao over his insistence that the president is not doing enough to assert the Philippines' territorial rights in the West Philippine Sea against China.
Oh no!
Can you identify the source of the news? Do you believe that this statement directly came from President Duterte himself? What's your final verdict? Is it real or fake? You are right. This is fake news. In today's social media-driven society, it is a must that we study what we come across in social media before believing and sharing them. This is just one example where your knowledge of identifying if an information came from a primary or secondary source will come in handy. It is a skill that everyone must develop.
Don't worry, TBFLEx has got you covered. When you were in grade 7, primary and secondary sources were discussed. The question is, can you still remember them?
Okay, I'm ready.
Let's put your knowledge to a quick test.
I will be giving you 5 seconds to read the following entries and determine if they belong to primary or secondary sources of information. Number 1. A classroom history textbook. Number 2. A copy of the Philippine Constitution. Number 3. An opinion of the editor from a newspaper. Number 4. A map of Africa from the 1990s. Number 5. Anne Frank's autobiography, The Diary of a Young Girl. These are the correct answers. Copy of the Philippine Constitution, Map of Africa from the 1990s, and Anne Frank's autobiography, The Diary of a Young Girl, are all primary sources. Meanwhile, classroom history textbook and opinion of the editor from a newspaper are all secondary sources. Did you get the correct answers? That's awesome! Now, let's move forward with our discussion on primary and secondary sources of information.
In writing academic essays or researches, you have to gather information or evidence from a variety of sources, like books, news articles, interviews, or even websites. In this episode, I will be giving you samples of primary and secondary sources of information. In addition, I will also be giving you tips on how and when to use them accordingly. Primary sources provide first-hand account of an event or time period. They represent original thinking, reports on discoveries or events, or they can share new information.
Normally, these sources are created at the time the events took place, but they can also include sources that are created later. In addition, they are also the first formal appearance of original research. Primary sources include original documents such as diaries, speeches, manuscripts, letters, interviews, records, eyewitness accounts, autobiographies. Primary sources also include empirical scholarly works such as research articles, clinical reports, case studies, and dissertations. Furthermore, primary sources also include creative works such as poetry, music, video, and photography.
Secondary sources involve analysis, synthesis, interpretation, or evaluation of primary sources.
They help explain new or different positions and ideas about primary sources. For example, journal articles, reviews, academic books, textbooks, and commentaries.
How will you recognize a primary source from a secondary source of information?
For example, if you have a novel as a primary source of information, you can have an article analyzing that novel as your secondary source of information. If you have a painting as your primary source of information, then you can use an exhibition catalog explaining the painting as your secondary source of information. If you have letters and diaries written by a historical figure as your primary source of information, then you could use a biography of that historical figure as your secondary source of information. If you have photographs of an historical event as your primary source of information, then you can utilize documentaries about the historical event as your secondary source of information. If you have government documents about a new policy as your primary sources of information, then you can use newspaper articles about that new policy as your secondary sources of information. If you have the results of an opinion survey as your primary source of information, then you can use blog posts interpreting the result of the survey as your secondary source of information. If you have an empirical study as your primary source of information, then you can use literature review that cites that study as your secondary source of information.
Which do you think is better? Is it primary or secondary source of information?
Most studies use both primary and secondary sources. They complement each other to help you build a convincing argument. Primary sources are more credible as evidence, but secondary sources show how your work relates to existing researches.
Are you ready to apply what you have learned in our discussion?
Yes, sir.
That's the spirit.
In your notebook, sort out the following sources of information into primary and secondary. Write P if it's primary and S if it's secondary. Number 1. Biography of Cabueño hitmaker Veni Saturno. Number 2. Interview with Filipino basketball phenom Kai Soto. Number 3. Original photo of Cabuyao City's St. Polycarp Parish. Number 4. Article about martial law's human rights violations. Number 5. Painting of renowned Filipino artist Ben Cabrera. Number 6. A blog analyzing the risk of face-to-face classes amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Number 7. Letters written by Jose Rizal. Number 8. Video recording of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Number 9. A journalism textbook. Number 10. Research about the COVID-19 Omicron variant. Here are the correct answers. Number 1 is a secondary source. Number 2 is a primary source. Also, number 3 is a primary source. Number 4 is a secondary source. Number 5 is a primary source. Number 6 is a secondary source. Number 7 is a primary source. Number 8 is also a primary source. Number 9 is a secondary source. And number 10 is a primary source of information. How well did you do in our exercise? Did you get the answers correctly? Excellent! I knew you could do it! Now that you have got the hang of it, it's now time to proceed to your Quarter 4, Week 3 Self-Learning Module and answer Learning Task Number 2 and Number 3. Just remember what we have discussed and you're on your way to mastering this lesson about primary and secondary sources of information.
So what do you think of today's episode? If you have an extra time, go ahead and flex what you've learned in our discussion in your social media accounts. Don't forget to include our official hashtags, hashtag TBFLEx, and hashtag flexible learning. Once again, this is Sir Mark, your guide to reliable source of flexible and engaging learning, TBFLEx.